She slipped quietly into seat 7F, unnoticed by the crowd that buzzed around her. It was the kind of noise only airports could make, a mixture of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, children's laughter, and the distant crackle of announcements echoing through the terminal. For most people, it was a day like any other. Flights were boarding, destinations were being called, and people were consumed with their own worlds. She carried nothing remarkable with her. A modest bag tucked under her arm, a simple jacket against the chill of the cabin, and eyes that seemed fixed on something far away. She placed her belongings carefully beneath the seat, as though she had done this hundreds of times before, and sat with the quiet dignity of someone who preferred not to be noticed. The woman in seat 7F looked like anyone's neighbor, anyone's aunt, anyone's grandmother. Yet there was something about her presence, something in the way she straightened her posture, the way her eyes flicked once around the cabin as if measuring exits and details others ignored. It was subtle, the kind of habit ingrained by years of discipline and routine, but it was there for anyone observant enough to notice. Around her, life unfolded in its ordinary way. A businessman in a crisp suit argued softly with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in clipped tones about contracts and deadlines. Two young college students, sitting across the aisle, compared playlists on their phones and joked about the vacation ahead. A mother leaned over her toddler, distracting him with a toy airplane as he kicked excitedly at the seat in front of him. Everyone was caught in their own little stories, their own bubbles of existence. For her, however, the bubble was not so small. She sat by the window, hands folded in her lap, and gazed beyond the glass at the runway. The sight of it stirred something in her chest, a familiar pull she hadn't felt in years. Long ago, she had watched runways from another perspective, not as a passenger waiting for takeoff, but as a voice guiding those who lifted into the air. Voices like hers were rarely remembered. The pilots got the glory, the medals, the photographs. But in the hidden rooms, lit by glowing radios and covered in maps, her voice had once been the steady anchor for countless flights. She shifted slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and smiled faintly at the memory. Her past wasn't a story she told often. To the young, it would sound distant, irrelevant, a relic of a world where radios crackled and voices carried through storms. To her, it was everything: the years of night shifts, the moments of tension when she had to decide what to say, and when silence meant disaster. A flight attendant passed by, offering a polite smile as she checked overhead bins. The woman in seat 7F nodded back, her own expression unreadable but kind. She had learned to blend in, to move quietly through spaces without drawing attention. That skill had served her well in service, where invisibility meant effectiveness. Nobody ever asked who sat behind the radio. They just trusted the voice. That was enough. As the aircraft doors closed and the engines rumbled awake, she adjusted her seatbelt and leaned back against the fabric. The vibrations of the machine carried through her body, a reminder of countless times she had sat with a headset pressed to her ears, listening to similar vibrations in her imagination. She could almost hear it, the roar of engines across frequencies, the clipped tones of pilots, the static that filled the silence between words. The plane taxied toward the runway. Around her, people grew restless, some fiddling with magazines, others with phones or headphones. The excitement of departure for many was a moment to distract themselves. But she sat still, her eyes tracing the pattern of painted lines on the tarmac, remembering how often she had visualized runways she never physically touched. For her, those runways had been lifelines, coordinates, and paths to safety. When the engines surged and the aircraft lifted, the cabin tilted, pressing passengers into their seats. Children squealed, adults gripped armrests, and the world outside shifted from ground to sky in a matter of seconds. She simply closed her eyes and let the moment pass. She had spent so many years listening to takeoffs through radio transmissions that the physical sensation seemed familiar, almost natural. The climb into the clouds was like being welcomed back into a world she had never quite left behind. At 30,000 feet, the seatbelt light clicked off, and the cabin settled into the rhythm of flight. Conversations resumed, trays lowered, and the ordinary hum of travel returned. She unfolded a small book from her bag, though her eyes hardly moved across the page. Instead, they wandered back to the window, where the vast expanse of sky stretched endlessly in every direction. There was something about being here again, in the quiet space between Earth and stars, that made her reflective. She thought about the men and women who had once relied on her voice, young, nervous, brave, determined. Some had been little more than boys when they first heard her words, and yet they had carried out missions that demanded everything of them. She remembered calming trembling hands over the radio, guiding jets through storms when visibility was gone, and offering coordinates that meant the difference between safety and tragedy. Her voice had been their compass. She knew that now. And though they had never seen her face, she had been with them in those skies always. She turned a page in her book, but the letters blurred into the background of memory. The past was never far, especially up here, where the thin air and quiet hum reminded her of nights spent in small rooms filled with maps and static. She wondered if any of them still remembered her voice. Did they ever think of the woman who had been there in the shadows, unseen but vital? Or had time, as it so often did, erased her from the pages of memory? It didn't matter, she told herself. She hadn't done it for recognition. She had done it because she believed in the mission, in the duty of keeping others safe, in being part of something greater than herself. That was what service had meant, sacrifice without applause. Still, as she stared at the horizon, she couldn't help but feel that the sky remembered. The clouds, the air, the endless stretch of blue, they had witnessed everything. And today, as she sat quietly in seat 7F, the sky seemed to whisper back, waiting for the moment when past and present might meet again. She took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and let the hum of the engines lull her into a calm state. To anyone glancing her way, she was just another passenger, lost in thought as the world passed by outside the window. But within her, the silence of years stirred gently, as though something unexpected was waiting ahead. Seat 7F was just a number, just a place on a chart of names and tickets. Yet for her, it was becoming the threshold of a story she never planned to tell again, but one that would soon come alive in the most unexpected way. The plane leveled off above the cloud line, its steady hum settling into a rhythm that soothed most passengers into comfort. Seatbelt lights dimmed, trays clinked into place, and flight attendants moved down the aisles with practiced ease. For many on board, it was the perfect moment to sink into books, headphones, or the dull comfort of half-sleep. But in seat 7F, she leaned against the oval window and let her eyes wander across the horizon. The sky stretched endlessly in pale shades of blue, broken only by the scattered cotton-white ridges of clouds below. It was a sight she had seen countless times, yet one that still stirred something within her chest. The sky was her old companion. To anyone else, this was just another flight routine, uneventful, predictable. To her, it was a reminder of a world she once inhabited, a world defined not by passenger comfort and beverage carts, but by voices carried across crackling frequencies. In that world, every call mattered, every second counted, and every word could mean the difference between someone returning home or being lost forever. She closed her eyes briefly, and the hum of the engines blurred into another sound, the faint hiss of radio static. She could almost hear it, like a ghost whispering from memory. The clipped tones of pilots calling in, the firm commands exchanged, the occasional tremor of fear hidden behind carefully measured words. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Those voices had once been her responsibility. Back then, she was never in the cockpit. She never felt the G-forces press against her chest, never handled a stick or throttle, never saw the world from beneath the canopy of an A-10. But she was there all the same, invisible yet essential. Her duty was to be the calm in chaos, the steady voice when pilots were young, scared, and far from home. Her call sign had been simple, easy to remember. Pilots didn't need a name. They needed a beacon, a reassurance that someone was watching over them, guiding them through storms and fire alike. She had spoken with hundreds over the years, each with their own nervous laugh, their own quiet fears, their own determination. Some came back. Others didn't. The memory of those who hadn't returned still lingered. Her fingers curled against the armrest as she thought of them. The boys barely out of their teens, their voices breaking not from static, but from the weight of what they faced. She had learned long ago to keep her own voice even, controlled, soothing. In those moments, it wasn't just about relaying instructions. It was about giving them something to hold on to, an anchor in the storm. "Stay with me," she used to say, though not always in those words. Sometimes it was just a tone, a steady rhythm that carried through the chaos. She remembered nights where she had whispered coordinates like a lullaby, guiding pilots through darkness they couldn't see beyond. There were storms so heavy that even radar blurred, but still she had to be clear, precise, unwavering. And then there were missions, the ones nobody spoke of at family dinners or in glossy magazines. Missions where danger was constant, where a voice carried more than instructions. It carried hope. She could still recall the silence that came when communication cut, the sharp ache in her chest when minutes stretched too long before a pilot's voice returned. Each time they came back, she allowed herself a small exhale. Each time they didn't, she swallowed the grief alone, because radio operators weren't supposed to cry where anyone could hear. She tilted her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the clouds shift. How many times had she stared at skies like this, waiting for transmissions to break through? How many times had she wondered, long after she retired, if those she guided ever thought of her again? She doubted it. Pilots remembered missions, comrades, the machines they flew. But voices? Voices faded. Hers was probably one of thousands they had heard, a faint echo in a storm of memories. And yet, deep inside, she knew she had mattered. Maybe not in names or stories, but in survival. It was a strange kind of existence, to be both present and invisible. She had no medals displayed in a case, no photographs in history books, no grand recognition. But she didn't mind. She had never done it for glory. She had done it because service demanded sacrifice, and hers had been to stay unseen while others shone. A soft laugh escaped her as she thought of the irony. Here she was again, high above the world, just another anonymous passenger sipping ginger ale in a crowded cabin. No one around her had the faintest idea of who she had once been, of the role she had played in skies like these. To the man beside her, buried in his laptop, she was just a quiet older woman traveling somewhere. To the college students giggling across the aisle, she was invisible. That, she thought, had always been her role, present yet unseen. The flight attendant stopped by her row, offering a beverage. She asked for water, her voice soft, and the attendant smiled before moving on. The moment was ordinary, fleeting. But as she sipped, her eyes stayed locked on the horizon. Somewhere out there, she thought, there were still pilots training, still voices crackling across radios, still missions unfolding beyond public eyes. Perhaps a replacement, a younger operator with quicker reflexes, newer equipment, and fresh training was guiding them now. Perhaps someone else's calm voice filled the silence when fear threatened to break through. The thought gave her comfort. The mission always continued. Her gaze drifted upward, tracing the contrails of distant aircraft, cutting white scars across the sky. She wondered if any of those pilots had ancestors who once relied on her voice. Generations carried forward quietly, without fanfare, yet linked by unseen threads of memory and service. She leaned back, allowing herself to sink into reflection. Every flight she had ever guided had etched itself into her in some way, but few people around her would ever understand that weight. Service was like that. It carved itself into the soul without leaving marks the world could see. The man beside her shifted, typing quickly into his computer, oblivious. The toddler 2 rows up laughed, shaking his toy airplane. Passengers ordered coffee, flipped through magazines, stretched, yawned. The world around her remained ordinary, but within her, the sky had opened old wounds and old pride alike. She wasn't just a passenger in seat 7F, not to herself, not to the sky. And though she had long accepted that her chapter had closed, something in the air that day felt different. It was as though the sky itself was holding its breath, waiting. She didn't know yet that fate was arranging an encounter she could never have imagined, a reunion, written not in calendars, but in clouds. For now, she sat quietly, her water untouched on the tray, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where memories and reality blurred together. She could almost hear them again, the pilots, the static, the clipped confirmations. Her voice among them, steady as ever. The woman in seat 7F carried her past like a shadow. And high above the earth, in the sanctuary of the clouds, that shadow stirred. The flight had settled into that quiet rhythm familiar to anyone who had traveled long enough. The engines hummed steadily, passengers shifted into comfortable slouches, and the air inside the cabin carried the mingled scents of coffee, plastic trays, and recirculated oxygen. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary flight. She sat in seat 7F, her gaze still fixed on the horizon beyond the window. The book in her lap remained unopened, a prop more than a pastime. Her mind was elsewhere, drifting between the present and the past, when a chime sounded above the cabin and the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with the calm cheer of someone who had delivered countless announcements. "If you look out of the windows on the left side of the aircraft, you may be able to spot something unusual today. We've been cleared to fly alongside part of a U.S. Air Force training exercise. Below us, you'll notice several A-10 Thunderbolts in formation. Quite a rare sight from this altitude, so enjoy it while it lasts." The effect on the passengers was immediate. Dozens of heads turned toward the windows. Conversations sparked as parents lifted their children higher, as phones appeared in hands, and as passengers pressed close to catch a glimpse of the gray aircraft cutting through the sky below. Excitement rippled through the cabin. The college students across the aisle gasped loudly, fumbling with their phone cameras. The toddler with the toy airplane shrieked with joy, pointing wildly. But the woman in seat 7F did not reach for her phone. Her breath caught as her eyes fell on the unmistakable silhouettes below. Wide, straight wings. Twin engines mounted high and behind the cockpit. A snub-nosed, sturdy frame, designed not for beauty, but for purpose. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog. Her heart stirred with something sharp and familiar. These planes were not just machines to her. They were memories. They were voices she had once carried across the airwaves. They were faces she had never seen, but had known more intimately than most ever could. She remembered the first time she had spoken to a pilot flying one of those. He had been young, nervous, and new to the skies. She had caught the tremor in his voice as he called in, struggling to mask his unease with military precision. She remembered how she had steadied her own tone, offering coordinates with clarity, pacing her words to give him something solid to hold on to. "You're not alone up there," her cadence had said, even if her words never did. Over time, she came to know the warthog pilots by their rhythms, their habits, their silences. Each voice carried its own signature. Some clipped and brisk, some almost too casual, some trembling just at the edges when stress pressed too hard. And always, she had been there calm, steady, a presence that didn't falter even when they did. Now, decades later, she watched them carve clean lines across the air below her, and it was as if the sky itself was reaching back into her life. The passengers around her marveled aloud, oblivious to the weight of what they were witnessing. To them, it was a spectacle, a rare glimpse of military hardware in action. To her, it was a reunion of sorts, though the pilots below had no idea she was watching. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the window, her chest tightening. One of the planes banked slightly, its broad wings gleaming in the afternoon sun. The sight drew her deeper into memory. She remembered the storm. Not one storm, but many, each different, yet somehow the same. Sheets of rain hammering against metal, lightning breaking across black skies, radios filled with static, so dense it threatened to drown out voices. In those moments, pilots had turned to her voice as their guide. "You're clear to adjust bearing," she had said calmly, though her heart pounded. "Maintain altitude. Storm line will break in 8 miles. And when the static swallowed her, she had repeated until they answered, her voice relentless, determined. She remembered the silence that followed missions, the calls that never came back, the channels that remained empty. Those were the hardest, the losses nobody saw, the grief she could never share, because her role was to remain steady for the next pilot, the next mission. Her tears had belonged to the quiet corners of her own room, never to the frequency where others needed strength. And now here they were again, the aircraft that had defined so much of her life, gliding gracefully beneath the very plane she sat in. Her neighbor, a man, still buried in his laptop, finally glanced out the window and let out a low whistle. "Impressive, isn't it?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. She only nodded, her throat too tight to answer. The college students snapped photo after photo. "This is insane," one of them whispered. "Like, who gets to see this on a commercial flight?" The mother with the toddler laughed as her child waved his toy airplane toward the window, mimicking the A-10s below. Ordinary passengers reacted with joy, surprise, amusement. But for her, the moment was something else entirely. It was a bridge between who she had been and who she had become. The captain spoke again. "They'll be with us for a few minutes before breaking away to continue their exercise. Please remain seated as we pass through this sector." His voice was casual, but she could hear the undertone of respect. Pilots, even commercial ones, always held a certain reverence for the A-10 and those who flew it. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered it from the glass. The hum of the engines above blended with the memories in her mind. She thought of the pilots who had once leaned on her voice. Were any of them still flying now, perhaps even down there in one of those warthogs? Or had the years swept them into retirement, into lives as ordinary and anonymous as hers? The thought ached, but it also warmed her. Even if none of the pilots below knew who she was, the planes themselves were enough. They were proof that the work she had once done still lived on, carried forward by others, by new voices, by younger operators who had taken her place. Still, as she watched the formation tighten below, she couldn't shake the sense that the sky was whispering something to her, that this was not just coincidence, that somehow her past and her present were circling closer, preparing to touch in a way she had never expected. The woman in seat 7F leaned back against her chair, her eyes fixed firmly on the planes below. The chatter of passengers faded, the announcements blurred, the clinking of trays vanished. There was only the sky, the hum, and the thunder of memory. And deep within her, something stirred. She didn't know it yet, but the moment was coming, The moment when her quiet anonymity would shatter, when the voice she thought was gone would return, and when the A-10 pilots below would answer her not with words, but with a salute etched into the skies. For now, she simply watched. The sky was no longer just scenery. It was a mirror, holding up her past in broad, gray wings. The cabin had just begun to relax again after the excitement of seeing the A-10s. Phones went back into pockets, trays lowered once more, and passengers resumed their ordinary chatter. For most, it had been a fleeting thrill, something to tell friends about later, a story for social media. But for the woman in seat 7F, the sight lingered like a heartbeat she couldn't slow down. Her eyes stayed glued to the window, following the formation even as it began to drift slightly ahead of their commercial jet. She pressed her hand lightly against the glass, as though trying to hold on to them. Then it happened. At first, it was only a flicker of sound, a crackle through the overhead speakers. Passengers frowned, some pulling off their headphones to listen. The flight attendants paused mid-step. A few muffled words bled into the cabin, rough and distorted, before fading again into static. The captain's voice returned briefly, apologizing for the interference. But for her sitting rigid now, her entire body alert, the single fragment she heard was enough. A call sign. One she knew. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't possible, she told herself. Decades had passed since she last sat behind a radio console, since her voice had carried across military frequencies. And yet, what she had heard was unmistakable. That string of letters and numbers, delivered in the clipped cadence of a pilot in formation, it was familiar in a way nothing else could be. Her heart pounded, and with it came instinct. Not hesitation, not doubt. Instinct. Before she fully realized what she was doing, she unbuckled her seatbelt and rose from 7F. Passengers turned to look at her as she moved with purpose down the aisle, her steps quick but controlled. She didn't rush like someone panicked. She walked like someone who knew exactly what she needed to do. A flight attendant intercepted her halfway. "Ma'am? You'll need to remain seated." She raised a hand, her voice calm but firm. "I need to speak with your captain. It's important. Please." There was a steel in her tone that stopped the attendant mid-sentence. For a moment, doubt flickered across the young woman's face. Then she nodded and gestured toward the front of the plane. The other attendants watched, curious but silent. When she reached the cockpit door, another attendant hesitated before knocking gently and speaking quietly into the interphone. A moment later, the door opened slightly, just enough for the captain to lean out. He was a man in his 40s, his expression polite but wary. "Can I help you, ma'am?" She looked him directly in the eye. "I know what you just picked up through the interference. That call sign, it's military. A-10 formation. I need to speak to them." The captain blinked, taken aback. "I'm afraid that's not possible. Our radios aren't." She cut him off with a tone that carried no malice, but absolute certainty. "I was a radio operator for those very aircraft. I know their channels, their language, their calls. If I heard that frequency bleed, it means your equipment picked up something we can reach. Give me 30 seconds. The captain studied her. She could see the calculation in his eyes. An older woman, a passenger among hundreds, making a request that seemed absurd. But she also knew what he was seeing, the way she stood, her posture, the authority in her voice. Not a frantic passenger. Not a curiosity seeker. Someone who had spent years commanding the airwaves, steady in moments where hesitation meant death. Behind him, the first officer leaned closer, frowning. "She knew it was A-10s before we even said the type," he murmured. "Maybe we should hear her out." The captain hesitated a second longer, then sighed. "All right. 30 seconds." He stepped aside, and she entered the cockpit. The moment she crossed the threshold, it was as though time collapsed. The hum of instruments, the flicker of screens, the radio headset waiting. It was not the same as the consoles she had once used, but the atmosphere was familiar enough to awaken everything she thought she had left behind. The captain gestured toward the headset. "We've got a bleed on a secondary frequency. I'll patch you through, but keep it brief." Her fingers trembled only for a moment as she reached for the headset. The weight of it settled over her ears, and with it came silence, broken only by the faint hiss of static. She closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, and exhaled. Then, pressing the button, her voice filled the channel. "This is—" She hesitated, then used the call sign she hadn't spoken in years. "This is Watchtower. Do you copy?" For a moment, nothing. Only static. She pressed again, her voice steadier now, falling into the rhythm that had once been second nature. "Hammer Flight, if you can hear me, acknowledge. This is Watchtower." The cockpit remained silent, but for the hiss. The captain glanced at her, doubtful. But then faint at first, then clearer the response came. "Watchtower?" The voice cracked slightly, laced with disbelief. "Say again." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. She pressed once more, her tone calm, almost soothing. "Hammer Flight, it's been a long time. Stay steady. Keep your wings tight. The ground's still watching you." The frequency erupted with chatter. Not frantic, but astonished. Pilots spoke over one another, their voices stunned, recognizing the phrase. It wasn't just instruction. It was hers. It was the line she had always used, the one that told them they were not alone. Her chest tightened as memories and reality collided. She had never expected to hear their voices again, never expected the sky to give her this chance. The captain and first officer exchanged wide-eyed glances, clearly grasping that something extraordinary was unfolding. Below, the A-10s adjusted their formation. The woman in seat 7F once, just another passenger, had reached across decades, across silence, and reclaimed her place in the skies. For a moment, she was no longer in an airline cockpit. She was back in the dim radio room, headset on, guiding her pilots home. And this time, they had heard her. The headset felt heavier than she remembered. In her youth, it had been just another tool, plastic, wires, and static between her and the men who flew steel beasts across hostile skies. But now, in this quiet cockpit high above America, it felt like the weight of time itself pressing against her temples. Her hand steadied against the armrest. She forced her breath to level, knowing that pilots on the other end could hear every tremor, every flicker of uncertainty. Her training returned instinctively, guiding her tone into one of unshakable clarity. "This is Watchtower," she repeated into the mic, voice calm, clipped, firm. "Hammer Flight, do you copy?" Silence stretched. Static hissed like a serpent across the channel. For one terrible moment, she wondered if she had been foolish in aging voice, intruding on frequencies where she no longer belonged. Then the reply broke through, rough but clear. "Watchtower? Say again?" Her lips curved faintly. That note of disbelief, half question, half recognition, was unmistakable. She pressed the button again, her voice steady now, drawing on the cadence that had once anchored entire missions. "Hammer Flight, it's Watchtower. Tighten your wings. Eyes forward. The ground's still watching you." The phrase was hers. Not a textbook line, not something written in a manual, but the exact words she had carried through storm and fire. It was the reassurance she had whispered countless times to pilots struggling with fatigue, fear, or chaos. And now, decades later, she cast it into the sky once more. The channel erupted. "Copy Watchtower," one voice said, almost shouting. Another chimed in, incredulous. "No way. That's her. That's the Watchtower." A third pilot's laughter crackled. disbelieving but full of awe. "I thought you were just a story they told us at training." The cockpit around her seemed to shrink. The captain and first officer stared, transfixed, understanding nothing of the codes, but recognizing the weight of them all the same. The first officer mouthed silently, "It's her," though he had no idea who she truly was. She pressed the button again, heart hammering but words steady. "You're flying clean, Hammer. Keep that spacing sharp. I see you." Down below, in the gray cockpit of an A-10, a young pilot's jaw slackened. His hands gripped the stick tighter, the controls suddenly more alive. "She does see us," he whispered. His wingman grinned behind his oxygen mask, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't believe it after all these years." "They said she retired ages ago." The lead pilot keyed his mic. "Watchtower, this is Hammer 1. We hear you loud and clear." "It's an honor." Her throat tightened, but she refused to let her voice waver. "The honor was always mine, Hammer 1. Keep steady. The sky hasn't forgotten you." For the pilots, it was like hearing the voice of a guardian spirit. This wasn't just some stranger patching through. It was the voice from their training halls, the legend whispered by older squadrons. The woman who never cracked, never panicked, never let a man believe he was alone in the sky. They had trained under her phrases, her reputation, even if they never once saw her face. Now here she was, alive, her voice breaking across their channel from a civilian aircraft 30,000 feet above the ground. Inside the passenger cabin, a ripple of unease spread. Though they couldn't hear the exchange, they sensed something extraordinary was unfolding. Flight attendants lingered near the front, whispering in hushed tones. A man in 12C craned his neck, whispering, "What's going on up there?" Mothers hushed their children, while businessmen set aside laptops, sensing history in the air. Back in the cockpit, she exhaled slowly, her mind flashing with memories. She remembered one night when the desert sky burned with tracer fire, and a young pilot's voice cracked with fear as he reported damage to his left engine. She had spoken calmly, guiding him home through darkness and smoke until his wheels touched safely down. He had wept on the radio. She had not. She never allowed herself to. Her role had been to be the anchor, the voice that never bent. And now, hearing the awe in these pilots' voices, she realized something. Those long nights had not vanished into history. They lived on in the men who flew today. Her words had outlived her service. The captain gestured silently, urging her to continue. He seemed almost reverent, as if the cockpit belonged to her now. She keyed the mic once more. "Hammer Flight, this is Watchtower. You've got the sun at your back. Keep your eyes sharp. And remember, you're never alone up here." A pause. Then one voice answered, thick with emotion. "Copy that, Watchtower." Never alone. In their cockpits, pilots sat straighter, hands firm on the controls. The salute they would soon offer had not yet begun, but already they flew differently, more precise, more proud. The weight of history was with them, soaring at their wingtips. Inside the airliner, she finally removed the headset, her hand trembling just slightly as she passed it back to the captain. The first officer whispered, "Who are you?" She gave a small smile, her eyes soft but distant. "Nobody important. Just a voice." The captain opened his mouth to argue, to insist that wasn't true, but she had already turned, stepping quietly out of the cockpit and back into the aisle. When she returned to seat 7F, passengers glanced at her curiously. Some whispered, others simply stared. But she ignored them all, settling back into her window seat with the calm of someone who had fulfilled a duty long overdue. The headset's faint pressure still lingered against her ears, and for a moment she thought she could still hear them, the laughter, the disbelief, the gratitude of pilots who had recognized her. She pressed her palm against the window again, watching the A-10s hold formation just outside. Their wings gleamed in the sun, sharper, tighter than before. They were flying not just for their mission, but for her. For Watchtower. The headset was gone, but its echo clung to her ears, as though the voices were still there. She sat motionless in 7F, her palm pressed against the cool window. Beyond the glass, the A-10s held their formation steady, wings gleaming in the sharp sunlight. They seemed closer now, almost as if they were leaning toward her, listening. Down below, inside those cockpits of armor and firepower, the atmosphere was transformed. The young pilot who had spoken last, the one called Hammer 1, sat with his jaw set and eyes wide. His wingman, Hammer 2, shook his head in disbelief, a smile twitching beneath his oxygen mask. "It's really her," he whispered over the intercom. "The Watchtower. The one they told us about?" Hammer 1's grip tightened on the stick. In training halls and late-night hangars, they had heard the stories. A voice in the ether, calm in the face of chaos, guiding pilots through impossible skies. Some swore she was a myth, a legend invented by veterans to inspire recruits. Others claimed she had saved them personally, speaking words that carried them home when death clawed at their wings. But hearing her just now, steady, unwavering, unmistakable, made all the rumors real. "She's not just a story," Hammer 1 murmured, awestruck. "She's alive. She's up there. And she remembers us." In the passenger jet's cockpit, the captain and first officer still sat frozen. Neither had spoken since the last transmission. Their hands hovered over switches, their eyes fixed on the woman's retreating figure as she slipped back into the cabin. The first officer finally broke the silence. "Did that just happen?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Was she?" The captain cut him off, shaking his head slowly. "Don't even question it. That was history speaking into our cockpit." He leaned back in his chair, almost reverent. "I've flown 20 years, and I've never heard anything like that." Back in the cabin, passengers whispered among themselves. They hadn't heard the words, only seen the movement, the woman rising from her seat, walking forward with quiet authority, then returning with the faintest smile. Some dismissed it as nothing, a passenger who perhaps had comforted a crew member. But others, sensitive to the strange hush that had fallen, sensed more. Children pressed their noses to windows, pointing at the A-10s as they flew in perfect sync. Parents hushed them, though their own eyes remained wide. Something was unfolding outside their ordinary journey, something no boarding pass could have promised. The woman leaned back into her seat. For the first time in years, she felt the invisible tether pulling tight again between her and the sky. She had thought her service was forgotten, locked away in dusty records and fading memories. Yet the A-10s had answered. They had recognized her voice, their disbelief transforming into reverence mid-flight. It was as though the years between had folded away, leaving her once again as Watchtower. Not a widow in civilian clothes, not an anonymous passenger in Seat 7F Watchtower. Her eyes softened. She remembered a young lieutenant, fresh out of training, his voice trembling the first time he called her frequency. "Tower, this is Hammer 2. I don't know if I can do this." Her reply had been calm, her cadence unyielding. "You're not alone, Hammer 2. Eyes forward, wings tight. We see you." That pilot had lived, not because of her skill, but because of her steadiness. She had given him the courage to fly through the storm, and he had never forgotten her voice. Now new pilot sons of that same tradition were hearing her again. Inside their cockpits, Hammer Flight spoke in clipped tones, but they're all bled through. "You realize what this means?" One whispered. "Yeah," another answered. "It means the legends were real. She's real, and she just spoke to us." The lead pilot hesitated, then switched back to the open channel. His voice carried a gravity he rarely used. Watchtower. This is Hammer 1. We just want to say thank you. For every word, for every night. We've all flown with your voice in our ears, even those who never met you. Today, we got to hear it for real. Her eyes stung. She closed them briefly, drawing in a deep breath, then pressed her palm harder against the glass, as though reaching toward them. She did not reply aloud. The headset was gone. But in her heart, the words pulsed steady and strong. You were never alone. You never will be. Passengers around her noticed her expression, the stillness in her face. A man across the aisle leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Something's happening." "She's part of it." The A-10s shifted subtly, their formation tightening, their wings tilting in subtle acknowledgement. Even to untrained eyes in the cabin, it was clear. These weren't random maneuvers. This was choreography, a silent conversation written in the language of flight. The woman in seat 7F sat taller. She wasn't seeking attention, wasn't basking in recognition. But deep inside, a quiet pride stirred. She had thought she was only a forgotten voice, lost in static. Instead, she was remembered, not just remembered, but honored. The captain's voice returned briefly to the intercom, softer than usual, almost reverent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently sharing airspace with the United States Air Force training flight. What you are seeing out your windows is something extraordinary. Please, take a moment to appreciate it." He said no more, leaving mystery to hang in the air, but his tone alone carried weight. Passengers craned their necks again, phones rising like a forest of antennas. Yet when some glanced at the woman in 7F, they hesitated before raising their cameras. Something about her quiet composure told them this wasn't theirs to exploit, it was hers. Down below, the A-10 pilots continued to fly, their voices subdued on comms now, carrying a reverence that belied the machines they commanded. "She was real," one murmured again, almost to himself. "She is real," Hammer 1 corrected. In seat 7F, the woman let her hand fall from the window. Her pulse slowed, her breathing steady once more. The moment was not about her. It never had been. It was about them. The young pilots who carried the sky on their backs, who had just learned that the voice guiding them wasn't a ghost story, but flesh and blood. She had given them her words. They had given her their belief. And as the jet hummed steadily across the blue, a fragile balance settled between the two worlds, civilian and military, past and present, legend and reality. The tether that bound them all was not steel, not wings, not radios. It was voice, memory, trust. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The sky had shifted. It wasn't a change in weather, nor the tilt of sunlight across clouds. It was something subtler, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't trained their eyes to notice precision. The A-10's hammer flight had begun to move as one. Their wings leveled in unison, engines humming in perfect cadence, each plane tracing arcs with mathematical elegance across the pale blue. She pressed her palm against the window again. Her breath caught as she realized what was happening. This wasn't a routine training maneuver. This was something else. Something personal. The lead A-10 tilted its wings ever so slightly, dipping in a fluid gesture that seemed to ripple through the entire formation. The subtle nod carried weight and unspoken acknowledgement, a salute without words. Her chest tightened, and she gripped the armrest, letting herself be shaken by the sheer power of the moment. Passengers nearby noticed her sudden stillness. A man 3 rows back whispered, "Look, something's happening." Children pressed their noses to the windows. Their eyes were wide with wonder, unable to articulate why the scene before them felt different from any air show or movie. Adults felt it too, though they lacked words. Something in the air whispered of history, of valor, of stories that weren't in textbooks. The woman in 7F didn't move. She only watched as the formation tilted again, perfectly synchronized. It was precise, deliberate, impossible to miss. A salute to her, to the voice that had guided them through storms, fire, and years of uncertainty. She remembered her first training shift as a radio operator. A young pilot had asked her, nervously, "Do you ever get scared?" She had smiled faintly. "Fear doesn't matter," she said. "Control does. And when you trust each other, you'll always find your way." Now, decades later, she realized how much weight those words carried. The pilots below were not only acknowledging her past, they were recognizing the bond she had created, the trust she had instilled, the countless lives that had returned safely because of her guidance. "Look at them," she whispered softly to herself. They remember. In the cockpit ahead, the captain and first officer were mesmerized. They had witnessed countless military flights, but nothing like this. The subtle choreography, the precision of the wings, the almost imperceptible nods. It was a language they couldn't decode. Yet the emotion was unmistakable. Reverence filled the small space of the cockpit. Below, Hammer 1 keyed his mic, his voice steady but reverent. "Watchtower, this is Hammer 1. Consider this." Our salute. The formation responded in perfect unison. Wings dipped, engines hummed in synchronized rhythm, and the sunlight glinted off fuselages as though the planes themselves were shining in recognition. It wasn't flashy, wasn't cinematic. It was deliberate, precise, and filled with meaning. For the woman in 7F, the impact was overwhelming. She felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. This wasn't about emotion, it was about acknowledgement, the invisible bond between voice and sky, past and present. She had spent her life unseen, guiding pilots who never knew her face. Today, the sky had remembered her. Passengers whispered, pointing at the formation. Phones and cameras rose, capturing what they assumed was a rare maneuver. They didn't know that the salutes weren't for an audience. They were for her alone. A private ceremony of honor, witnessed only by a few hundred people trapped in their seats. She leaned back slightly, letting herself absorb the moment. Years of service, years of anonymity, of invisible effort, had culminated in this precise instant. Every mission she had guided, every pilot she had steadied, every moment of fear she had absorbed for others, everything had led to this skyward acknowledgement. The lead pilot's wings dipped once more, slower this time, almost languid, as if savoring the moment. The trailing aircraft followed in flawless imitation. To anyone looking, it might have seemed like a routine banking maneuver, but she knew better. She had guided them before, understood their rhythm, their signals. The gesture was meant solely for her. The flight attendants, initially unaware, began to notice the spectacle. One leaned over the intercom and whispered to her colleague, "They're saluting her." "I think that's what's happening." Her gaze didn't waver from the window. She thought of the young pilots who had trained under her years ago, some long retired, some lost to the skies. Each one had been touched by her voice. Now, through these aircraft, the legacy of their lessons and trust had returned to her in visible form. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she pressed her fingertips against the glass. It wasn't pride she felt, it was recognition. A life lived in service, unseen and unacknowledged, had finally been honored. Somewhere down the aisle, passengers whispered, sharing astonished glances. "Did you see that?" One woman asked, voice trembling. "I've never seen anything like it." "She's part of it," another man said, pointing at the woman in 7F. "I don't know how, but it's like they're saluting her." Children laughed and pointed, oblivious to the depth, but sensing that the moment was special. The mundane reality of the flight had dissolved. Ordinary travel had given way to something extraordinary. The woman in 7F didn't move from her window. She had nothing to do but watch and feel the culmination of decades of invisible service. This was a conversation she had never had, a recognition she had never expected. And yet, here it was, unfolding perfectly, without fanfare, without ceremony, but with unshakable clarity. The A-10 formation began to break slightly, adjusting for their exercise, but each aircraft still held a subtle dip toward her. It was a final acknowledgement, a farewell within the ongoing mission of flight. She watched until the last glint of gray disappeared into the horizon, her reflection mirrored in the window, mixing with the blue sky. Inside, the cabin remained hushed. Even the children had quieted, sensing the weight of what had just occurred. The ordinary rhythm of travel slowly returned, but the woman in seat 7F remained still, the moment etched permanently into her mind. The captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just shared airspace with a U.S. Air Force formation. What you witnessed was unique, a silent acknowledgement of skill and service. Please take a moment to appreciate the precision of our armed forces." Passengers clapped softly, a mixture of awe and politeness, but few truly understood what had transpired. For those in 7F, and for the pilots below, it was more than applause. It was history acknowledged. She exhaled slowly, letting herself finally relax. Her hand fell from the window. Her body had tensed through the entire event, but now she allowed herself the smallest, quiet smile. It was over, yet it wasn't. The bond remained, invisible but unbroken, stretching between her and the sky. For decades, she had guided voices she never saw. Today, the voices acknowledged her in a language beyond words. Seat 7F was just a number, but for her, it had become a bridge. For the first time in years, she felt that all her years of service, every lonely night at the radio, every mission, every voice guided, had mattered. And somewhere in the distance, the sky remembered. The last of the A-10s banked gently, engines roaring in a low, precise hum that slowly faded into the distance. The formation, perfect and deliberate moments ago, now began to scatter into their assigned training zones, leaving nothing but the echo of memory across the sky. She pressed her palm against the window one last time, watching the gray silhouettes shrink and vanish against the horizon. The wind, the altitude, the hum of the engines in the commercial jet, it all felt like a gentle exhale, a return to normalcy, yet somehow the world had shifted beneath her feet. The cabin was quiet. Passengers exchanged glances, murmured softly, and lowered their phones, some still stunned. No one had words for what they had witnessed, yet they all sensed the weight of history, of something extraordinary. Ordinary air travel had become a witness to a legend alive in their midst. The woman in 7F leaned back, her hands slipping from the window. Her heart still raced, yet a serene calm settled over her. She had never sought recognition, never wanted accolades, never craved applause. Her role had always been invisible, essential yet unremarkable in appearance. Today, however, the invisible had become visible, not through spectacle, but through acknowledgement, respect, and the quiet language of the sky. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, checking on passengers who were still staring at the horizon. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, did you see that? They were like superheroes." Her mother nodded quietly, glancing at the woman in 7F with a faint smile. "Yes," she said softly. "And that lady, I think she was their superhero." Even the captain returned briefly to the intercom, his voice measured but tinged with reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our journey, take a moment to reflect on the skill, dedication, and history you've just witnessed. What you saw is a reminder that service often exists beyond what the eye can see, and that the quiet dedication of a single individual can shape the lives of many. Passengers nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Phones were stowed. Eyes that had once traced the clouds in formation now traced the woman. Seat 7F, her presence somehow larger than life in the ordinary cabin. She remained quiet. She didn't seek acknowledgement. She only felt it deep in her chest, where the memory of decades of service had long been stored away like a carefully hidden diary. Her mind drifted to the pilots she had guided over the years. Young faces now older, perhaps teaching others, perhaps commanding squadrons, perhaps retired with stories few would ever hear. She had never seen most of them in person, yet she had been with them in every storm, every emergency, every mission, where their survival hung by the thread of a voice over the radio. And now, through this strange alignment of fate and sky, they had recognized her. A salute, a dip of wings, a gesture that transcended spoken language, performed hundreds of feet below her. In the air, she had once navigated in spirit, if not in body. The realization washed over her. Her life of quiet service, unseen by the public, was meaningful. It mattered. It had made a difference. She had always believed that the work itself was the reward, but now she felt a deeper truth. Legacy is not measured in accolades, but in acknowledgement from those whose lives you've touched. She looked out the window one last time. The sky had returned to its usual calm, clouds drifting lazily across a pale blue expanse. Yet the memory of their salute lingered, etched into her mind, a living testament to the invisible bridges she had built across time, space, and generations of pilots. The passengers slowly returned to their routines, reading, napping, sipping beverages, but some still glanced at 7F. She caught a few discreet smiles, the silent understanding that she had just shared something extraordinary. For them, it was a story to tell, a moment to carry. For her, it was quiet closure, a final chapter written not in books, but in the skies above. The flight continued smoothly, engine steady, turbulence absent. She rested her hand in her lap, allowing herself a small smile. This was not a triumph in the usual sense. It was not in front of cameras or crowds. It was a triumph of memory, of lives touched, of decades of invisible guidance now recognized. The plane began its descent toward its destination. The ground approached steadily, familiar sights returning. Fields, rivers, towns, rooftops. Ordinary life. But the extraordinary lingered in her chest. She knew that somewhere, in the depths of the Air Force communications network, the pilots would recount this moment for years to come. The legend of Watchtower, alive and present, would now be a memory shared among them. She reflected on the countless nights spent behind a headset, alone in dimly lit rooms, listening to static, to the anxious calls of young pilots, to the chaos that sometimes filled the frequencies. Those nights had seemed lonely, unrewarding, invisible. Yet they had built something unshakable: trust, courage, and a bond that transcended distance and time. Her eyes softened, glancing at the flight attendants moving quietly down the aisle. Some smiled at her knowingly, though they could not understand fully. She returned their smiles, a small acknowledgement of shared human experience, of witnessing something rare, something beyond ordinary comprehension. Passengers began preparing for landing, adjusting seatbelts, stowing trays, and gathering belongings. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, some reflecting on the spectacle outside, others sharing theories about what had just occurred. The woman leaned back, serene, listening quietly to the hum of the engines and the occasional murmur from passengers. And then, as the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, tires skimming asphalt, she felt a sense of completion. Not just for this flight, not just for the recognition she had received, but for the entirety of her service, the decades spent unseen, unheard, yet crucial. She had been watchtower, guiding, stabilizing, calming. Today, the sky itself had saluted her. And that salute, performed in silence, precision, and grace, was more than recognition. It was connection. Across time, across aircraft, across generations, the bond endured. The woman in 7F exhaled softly, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. She looked around the cabin at the ordinary people, the ordinary flight, the ordinary day made extraordinary by invisible threads reaching across decades. She realized something profound. Life's work, even when unseen, leaves ripples that find their way back, in unexpected ways, to touch you when you least expect it. The passengers disembarked slowly, talking quietly among themselves, some still pointing at the sky. She waited until the crowd thinned, standing quietly at the exit, savoring the final sense of the sky, the wind, the memory of wings dipping in salute. As she stepped out onto the tarmac, the hum of life below met her ears, familiar yet grounding. And in her chest, she carried the echo of the A-10s, the recognition, the legacy of Watchtower, alive and eternal. She smiled, walking away from the plane, knowing that her voice, once thought silent, had left a mark quiet, unseen, yet undeniable. And somewhere above, the sky remembered her, just as she remembered it.